Has Pokemon Scarlet and Violet made a big mistake? A lot of people seem to think so. So let's talk about it. Hey Charles, it's everyone. How are you today? Today we are diving into a big wave of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet controversy that's been swelling up over the past couple of months, so have a tinkle, grab a handful of mixed nuts, and get into your wetsuit. Because after reading countless discontented fan reactions to official website information that came out a little while ago, I thought it would be worth talking about the concern. That is that the game's gyms will allegedly not be level scaled. If you've never heard of level scaling, in short, level scaling is a mechanism in some RPGs by which the world adapts to the player's character or party level. There are a variety of approaches to level scaling, but in a nutshell it is typically done by adjusting the levels, stats, and sometimes the intelligence of the game's enemies proportionately to the player's progress. And some games do additional scaling by altering the amount and type of loot doled out, gating or unlocking specific side quests, etc, etc. Generally speaking, the purpose is to keep the game continuously engaging and challenging to the player as they grow stronger, but it can also serve to keep the difficulty ceiling low enough so that it never becomes too challenging. And to draw a bit of an odd comparison, it kind of reminds me of the I+1 theory of language acquisition developed by linguist Stephen Krasner in the 1970s, which theorizes that language acquisition is optimized when the material is just beyond a person's current level. In other words, you're not going to get to fluency in Japanese by reading Anpanman for the next 10 years, but jumping into something like Ningen Shikaku when you hardly know hiragana is going to be a crushing, demoralizing waste of time. It is important to hit the sweet spot to achieve consistent, optimized growth. And to tie that idea back to video games, you could say that the player's fun is optimized when the challenge is consistently just about one onion layer beyond their current level. After all, if a game is too easy, it's likely to become boring, and if it's too challenging, it's likely to become frustrating. But if the difficulty curve is just right for the duration of the game, then the player is likely to have a satisfactory experience. Or at least, that's the theory. But let's talk about how exactly all of this ties into the gym leader level system of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet right after we level up with today's sponsor, Bloodline, Heroes of Lithis. If you're new to the world of Bloodline, a visually stunning, story-rich, free-to-play RPG game for Android and iOS, now is the best time to jump in because the game just got its biggest update ever, and the newly added hybrid system is really something else, as the game's unique marriage system allows you to bring together champions from any two bloodlines to create new champions who inherit not only their parents' skills and appearances, but now a blend of their unique physical traits as well. With fantasy characters added to the game every month, the possibilities are endless when it comes to creating the greatest hybrid champions to suit your playstyle. And speaking of intriguing fantasy characters, the new vampire clan known as the Accursed is coming to your bloodline lineage just in time for Halloween. An undead clan that rose from the ashes of their homeland's cataclysm alongside the Dark Elves, the Accursed are the most terrifying assassins yet to be discovered in the world of Lithis. These Wraith Lords have been cursed with an insatiable thirst for blood that can be put to use to savage your enemies as well as to sustain the Accursed during lengthy battles. And by participating in the Halloween event that kicks off on October 27th, you'll be able to obtain an Accursed champion for free on the 7th day. Building your own kingdom and economy by raising heirs with your waifus or freaky wolfmen in Bloodline is a blast, and it's free to play for both Android and iOS, so download or try out the game for free using my link in the description or by scanning the online QR code. To get a special starter pack worth $20 that includes 10 energy potions, 100,000 gold, and 100 diamonds. Be sure to get your free vampire champion this Halloween, starting October 27th. Thank you to Bloodline Heroes of Lithis for sponsoring today's video, and with that said, onward to the meat and potatoes of today's chat. According to the current version of the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet website, these titles have the hallmark Pokemon story of going to gyms and aiming to become a champion, but there's no set path, so you can go to whichever gym you want to challenge in the order you desire. You can purposely seek out a stronger gym leader, or you can simply stop by a gym that happens to be located in a town you came across on your journey. When this information was first released, many people on Twitter, Reddit, and online news outlets were quick to point out that stronger gym leaders obviously suggests that certain gym leaders are inherently more powerful than other gym leaders. And apparently various leaks support this line of thought, meaning that as in past Pokemon games, the gym leaders can be positioned on a static difficulty spectrum, with the classic Dragon Master type and his or her high-level stallions on one side, and Bugsy the Clown with his one or two unevolved Milksops on the other end, just waiting to get slapped around. In other words, the strength of the gym leaders is absolute. It does not shift relative to the player's level. There is, allegedly, no level scaling. And quite a few fans are not so happy about it. Firstly, we cannot confirm with 100% certainty that there is no gym level scaling whatsoever, and personally I do have some thoughts on level scaling which I'll explain in just a moment, but to give a fair shake to those who are pretty angry about a potential lack of level scaling, one facet of the argument seems to be that releasing an open world Pokemon game with a linear gym leader difficulty curve means that players aren't really so free to tackle the gyms in whatever order they choose to, and thus the open world is not so much of an open world to begin with. After all, without level scaling, if players venture into the wrong gym early on in their adventure, then they will probably be turning around and leaving town with nothing but a redder bottom and a lighter wallet, ultimately forcing them along a pseudo-linear track whereupon the freedom of an open world is merely an illusion, or so people say. And on the other side of the coin, heading into an easy gym in the late game could be such a cakewalk that it gives the player little to no sense of achievement. This was never a concern in past Pokemon games because they have all been relatively linear, with the player's course gated and directed in all kinds of ways such that the gyms will be tackled more or less, for the most part, in a fairly specific order. So the gym leader difficulty curve meshed quite cleanly with the structure of the games. But now that we have an open world, many fans feel that that model needs to be updated. And it's a reasonable viewpoint. A lot of people want a challenge consistently suited to their level, right in that I+1 sweet spot from start to finish. Because, as we've just discussed, venturing into a new area only to get slapped down and have to head elsewhere to grind can be a pain in the patootie, and putting every NPC to sleep in the late game could be a bit of a snore. Not to mention that the marketing blurbs bit about doing Victory Road any way you want, while at the same time suggesting that the game hasn't implemented any level scaling, is a little bit of an awkward sell. Again, as some would say, it makes for an open world experience that hardly feels open. That said, should it really be a requirement that an open world dynamically adapts the strength of its enemies to the player over the course of their adventure? Personally, I don't think so, as there are specific benefits that are unique to a static or relatively static level setup. And this is not to say that Pokemon Scarlet and Violet will do a great job of implementing such a setup, but regardless, let's 1. Take a look at level scaling from the other side of the fence, and 2. Discuss a few potential compromises, some of which could be, or perhaps even are already built into Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Firstly, I do think there is a good case for Skyrim-like level scaling in an open world Pokemon game, but operating under the assumption that open world does not necessarily need to equate to smooth difficulty curve, a lack of level scaling can actually work pretty well in its own way in open world games for 3 reasons: the sense of progression, the believability of the world, and the thrill of exploration. So let's quickly talk about each of these factors. Firstly, an unfortunate side effect of level scaling is that it can nerf the player's sense of progression. When you level up in an RPG and upward level scaling boosts low-ranking early area enemies up closer to your level, it may level out the game's difficulty spread and keep previously explored areas challenging, but one can't help but think that their sense of progress has been diminished, sometimes to a point that's quite frustrating. After all, it is demoralizing stacking your characters to the stars, only to struggle with early game rats and bandit jobbers in the late game. To make a comparison to one FPS game, when you increase the difficulty in Killing Floor 2, low-ranking enemies take on new abilities, become able to sprint, block headshots, dodge attacks, etc., rather than leaning on mere stat buffs. But most RPG games tend to rely on simple stat point boosts rather than having enemies shift their tactics. And this makes me remember how a game I otherwise love very much, Final Fantasy VIII, could get pretty frustrating on account of its level scaling system if you didn't know how to exploit the junction system and to avoid leveling up your own characters too much. Thank you, GameFAQs.com. Upward level scaling is also quite frustrating for players who get their kicks out of grinding to high levels to overcome tough bosses and to blow out the game's earlier enemies. And admittedly, it can be pretty satisfying to travel back to an area you struggled with earlier in the game with some players living for that moment like they live for a wink from the girl at Denny's. Some might argue that a lack of upward level scaling hurts the replayability of previously explored areas, but that is not necessarily the case, as players can be enticed back to previously explored areas by other factors such as new items, new quests, hidden zones roamed by powerful enemies, and so on, as in Shovel Knight or various other Metroidvania games. And let's be honest, would it really be all that fun to head back to Mount Moon in the late game, only to be swarmed by level 90 Zubats? I don't think so. Anyways, Secondly, it simply makes sense that some enemies are stronger than others in absolute terms, and these differences can be played up to good effect in a game's lore, but not necessarily so if level scaling is in place. For example, if a game's northern mountains are talked up by the locals as a hostile area inhabited by a giant, acid-breathing goat dragon, and if you push forward to that mountain range in the early to mid-game, only to get rattled by a seemingly undefeatable acid-breathing goat dragon, left to flee for your life, then the game's mechanics and lore are aligned and the experience feels real. On the other hand, level scaling can make a game's world feel like artificial, flubbery goop that is merely an extension of the player, rather than a living, breathing world that exists independently of them. For example, if you turn up to the northern mountains in the early to mid-game, only to find the acid-breathing goat dragon comfortably scaled down to your level so that you can beat it with just a little bit of fancy footwork, it kind of cheapens the world feel. Obviously, levels in and of themselves are artificial constructs, and game series like Zelda that essentially sidestep the level predicament altogether are perhaps the most believable, but RPGs are RPGs, and over the years playing them, I found that level scaling is often more off-putting than static levels. Not in terms of the difficulty curve itself, but in terms of the believability of the world and my journey through it. A classic example of wacky, world-breaking level scaling is that of Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion, wherein run-of-the-mill roadside bandits are awkwardly level scaled such that they come at you with princely weapons and the strength of Thor in the late game. Seeing common thugs dressed up like royal guards is jarring to say the least. And if their behavior had been scaled to start laying traps or stealing your equipment while you're sleeping in order to level the playing field once you'd significantly out-leveled them, instead of cracking out the Ultima weapons, then they wouldn't have broken the world feel as comically as they did. But they did. And so it is with the poorly implemented level scaling in many games. To be fair, Skyrim did a much better job with this, dividing the game's map into zones that leverage both player-centered level scaling as well as static level configurations. But henchmen and rats getting scaled up to test your godly late-game powers creates as much discord as ever in other game franchises. In summary, although static level setups can feel quite arbitrary at times, in my experience, I felt like they at least make the game's world feel like something grand and believable that exists outside of me, the player, as something I need to respond to, rather than something malleable that reforms itself to meet my needs. And conversely, that too much player-oriented level scaling can cheapen the believability of a world. Thirdly, level scaling can diminish the thrill of exploration and the personal satisfaction of bettering yourself. And to clarify, this chapter of our discussion is rooted in the downward aspect of level scaling. So bearing that in mind, I have one really great memory of playing Ragnarok online back in the early 2000s, wherein my party of beginners were exploring the lands and wandered into an ominous-looking forest. It was a big mistake that quickly turned our adventure into episode 1 of Goblin Slayer. Well, not quite. But as brutal as that lesson was, it was also thrilling to stumble upon horrifying monsters and realize that we had gotten in way over our heads. And nearly 20 years later, the shock and thrill of that adrenaline-pumping memory stands out clearly in my mind. The way I see it, just because a world is open to explore doesn't mean that you shouldn't have to explore it with some level of caution, paying attention to visual cues, what the residents tell you about certain areas, and so on, as the prospect of encountering real threats, and perhaps even overcoming them, is one of the most exciting aspects of exploration. Similar to my experience in Ragnarok Online, in Final Fantasy XII, you'll brush up against truly colossal enemies far beyond your capabilities, who are mixed in with the chaff as soon as you set foot out of the first city's gates. Recognizing these enemies as threats, and cautiously keeping your distance from them, or perhaps even daring to test the waters, is a high point of that opening stretch. As either way, you will find yourself left to wonder at what point you could possibly become powerful enough to take on such challenges head to head, and that makes for an exciting expanse of gameplay. Of course, once your party is totally stacked, you can come back to take them over the knee, and it is extremely satisfying to see just how far you've advanced your capabilities. Similar experiences can be found in games like Divinity Original Sin, Morrowind, and even Pokémon Sword and Shield's Wild Area, to an extent, wherein you can bump into big baddies far beyond your abilities if you are not careful, although the visual cues are typically fair, giving you a sense of what you're getting into. Speaking specifically to Pokémon Sword and Shield, in the midst of an experience that did have many good points, but was less fortunately mired in endless hand-holding, mandatory EXP share, overbearing linearity, and a general sense of emptiness that put some players to sleep faster than a bedtime mug of goat milk. It was really fun getting in over your head from time to time in the wild area, and finding yourself forced to throw in everything plus the kitchen sink and all the status condition magic you could muster to pull off the W or make the catch. And these encounters were the emotional high points of the game, in my opinion. So speaking specifically to the downward aspect of level scaling, I'd much rather be required to rise to the task than to have inherently inherently more powerful than me enemies stoop down to my level. Because the sense of self-mastery that comes with putting in the hard work to overcome a seemingly insurmountable challenge either then and there, or later on after coming back from building yourself up over the course of your adventures, is as satisfying in the games as it is in real life, wherein the adrenaline of being against the ropes and forced to sink or swim is electrifying. On the other hand, aggressive level scaling that candy cakes every encounter down to the player's level can siphon the risk out of an adventure such that it starts to feel more like a walk to the convenience store rather than an adventure. That is to say that dropping the player into a permanent comfort zone or a just a little bit challenging zone can stifle the extremes which make actual adventures so exciting compared to daily life. Speaking to the more extreme end of the comfort to thrill spectrum, the sense of real danger in horror games is what makes them so exciting to play and so beloved by the gaming community. And in a similar sense, the risk of taking a wrong turn in an RPG and bumping up against something or someone truly dangerous can be one of the most stimulating elements of the experience. In other words, if players are baby-stepped everywhere, then they never have the chance to become aware of their own weaknesses and truly push themselves to get better, whether that be in terms of stats or strategy or both. And moreover, they miss out on much of the risk, danger, and emotional peaks that define a good adventure. So while I think that both upward and downward level scaling mechanics have generally improved over the years and can smooth the difficulty curve quite nicely for most players when implemented well, they still tend to flatten the emotional variation experienced by the player in many games. On the other hand, while somewhat arbitrary and contributing to uneven difficulty curves that may not be satisfying to all players, as long as the game is fair about giving players a reasonable indication of where and what is just beyond or far beyond their level, static or relatively static level setups in open worlds simply create a different way of playing that can be highly rewarding for the reasons we have just discussed. Of course, some games do try to hit the sweet spot with tiered or partial level scaling systems, but to bring the conversation back to Pokémon, as somewhat of an aside, Legends Arceus was in part such a thrill due to the higher difficulty relative to other Pokemon games, as well as the risk of running into powerful enemies who could sweep you under the rug if you weren't careful. And there was also the risk of drawing multiple wild Pokemon into a conflict. So it presented the need to proceed with some level of caution, instead of running around willy-nilly like a birthday boy at the play park. And it made the game exciting, satisfying the third factor we just discussed in particular. And while it's looking like Scarlet and Violet will walk back some of the elements that made Legends Arceus so fresh and exciting, Scarlet and Violet may end up presenting a fairly smooth gym leader difficulty curve, even without level scaling, and while leaving some challenge on the table for the bold and the brave. This is because when we look at the map of the Paldea region, it seems that the region's geography will naturally guide players to the easier gym leaders first and the harder gym leaders later, all thanks to that enormous abyss in the center. As presumably the level 10 to 20 Timmies are clustered in the south where we began our adventure, and the 30 to 40 Fabios will start to emerge as we move around the donut towards the north. Working with this assumption in mind, players who prefer to explore in comfort shouldn't need to exert themselves much to deal with the tasks presented in the south, but players seeking challenge and excitement should be able to push north sooner rather than later. Assuming that the north is not arbitrarily blocked off too far beyond the early game, I think this will probably offer a pretty good balance to different types of players. In other words, while the game presumably has a static or fairly static gym leader level setup, the abyss in the center should softly buffer the difficulty without having to turn the world into flubbery putty with dynamic level scaling. Of course, although suggested by the website text and the leaks, it still hasn't been explicitly confirmed that the Pokémon Scarlet and Violet Gym Quest will be devoid of level scaling, nor has it been addressed as to whether or not the game's wild Pokémon or other challenges could themselves be level scaled. So it's still possible that the gyms could potentially implement a battle tower model that flattens level differences, and thus, instead of using stats as a basis, the relative strength of gym leaders could be differentiated based on their intelligence, team composition, movesets, etc., rather than raw stats. Or the games could even implement a weigh-in rule that flat out bans Pokemon over a certain level from competition, an unlikely but interesting concept. And setting the gym talk aside, as for wild Pokemon, some degree of level scaling could very well be implemented or perhaps restricted to certain zones, much like the Grand Underground in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, or the DLC zones of Pokemon Sword and Shield. I am still skeptical that we will see much by way of level scaling, but for the reasons we've discussed, I don't think that the lack of level scaling is the big mistake that some make it out to be. Moreover, the gym challenge isn't the only thing these games have going on for them, and assuming that the three major storylines are actually fleshed out to satisfaction, then there should be plenty of interesting and challenging stuff to do across the lands, even if some of the gyms are on the tough or easy side depending on the order in which they are tackled. In particular, as far as downward level scaling is concerned, if downward level scaling was layered on top of mandatory EXP share, and relentless NPC handholding, which are in turn layered on top of a franchise formula that has already been inherently easy ever since its inception, I think that this would simply turn the game into a flatter, less emotional, less exciting experience. We simply don't need yet another set of training wheels, when in all likelihood it will only take a few hours of solid on-the-road training to plow through everything the game has to offer. And I do suspect that the vast majority of players will be clearing out the easier gym leaders first, based on the game's geography. Perhaps giving players an Assassin's Creed Odyssey style option to toggle the difficulty level and level scaling would be the sweet spot. Not that I'm a big fan of that option, but as you've probably noticed, I basically just wanted to get some of my thoughts about level scaling out there today, and I'm curious what you think about level scaling and how it should or should not factor into the Pokemon universe. So, as always, let's chat.